Hello and welcome to RPG Tips again. This is my video on how to play a module, a pre-written adventure on your own solo. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for a bit more than a week now, and it's because not only it has been requested a lot by a lot of you, but I was also very interested in doing it because, well, I have, as you can see, some books that I want to play, and this is my first contribution to the hobby. My previous videos have been mainly recapping what others have done, but on this one I'm going to show you a rule set, basically an expansion to Mythic that I've created that will allow you to play a pre-written adventure on your own while keeping the surprise of it. Now, before I get into the actual rules, there's one thing I want to talk about, and that is the philosophy of playing a pre-written adventure on your own using a GM emulator. The main thing we must consider is that when we play using a GM emulator, we are having one very strong story driver, which is the GM emulator. If we then plug a module on top of it, we have two different story drivers, the adventure we want to play and the GM emulator, that are going to try to steer the narrative to different places. It is your job to join them together so you have as much of the module you want to have, and you keep a bit of surprise, because frankly, if you're not interested in surprise and you just want to play the story as is, you don't need all of this rules. Now, I have to say that my work is greatly influenced by The Lone Crusader, which is a website that is not already accessible, but I'll put a link on the description to the Internet Archive copy of it, and it's very interesting, but I feel like I've expanded a bit on it. Now, one note before I get right into the rules. You have everything that I'm going to explain in written form in a link on the description, and I've also posted a played example of my rules using a very short one-shot module for Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game called Night of Blood, and I intend to do a video going over that adventure in the future. For now, I'm just going to explain the base rules that I've created. So let's get right into it. My mechanics has several new parts that you will have to manage. The first one is called the adventure script, and that's just a fancy name for basically preparing the adventure. Yeah, of course, you're gonna have to read the adventure if you're going to run it. It's like if you were GMing it for your normal gaming group. You're gonna have to know what happens in the adventure. The good part of playing it on your own is that you don't have to prepare it and memorize it. You just need the adventure script. Basically, the adventure script is just a summary, a list of everything that relates to the adventure. It's composed of several elements. The main element of your script is going to be what I call the core, and that's basically the answers to the main questions in the adventure. What, how, when, why, and where. For instance, you'll see in the rules that I use as an example the Lord of the Rings. In this case, the what would be destroy the Ring of Power, how, throwing it to lava, when, soon, why, because Sauron is invading the West, and where, on Mount Doom. Then we've got the set pieces, which are the sequences of scenes in the adventure. Each scene will also have associated NPCs, locations that we'll see later. But for now, your set piece list is just the list of things that are going to happen. You should also, when you play each of those scenes, divide each scene into a series of plot points. We'll see why later. Another part of your adventure script is the NPCs, and you should define lots of things about them. Basically, how do they look? What can they do? Who are they related to? What do they want? And what's their role in the adventure? Again, we'll see why we do this later. The last three parts of the adventure script are the locations, objects, and others, which can cover prophecies, random events that can happen, encounters, songs, basically whatever doesn't fit the other categories. Then we get into the main mechanics of my rules, which I call the warp check, to do something that is similar to Mythic Variations 2. The warp check is something you do when an element from your adventure script comes up in your adventure. You need to define one number, which is called the warp threshold. That's one number between 1 and 10, and it defines how much you want to let Mythic drive your adventure. The way the warp check goes is you roll 1d10, and if the result is higher than your warp threshold, then that story element is as presented on the adventure. If it's equal or below it and even, then the story element is altered, like when a scene is altered in Mythic. If you roll equal or less than the warp threshold, if you roll equal or lower than the warp threshold, and you roll an odd number, then that element is created anew, completely different. You can either choose one of the other elements from the script or create a new one. And now we get to why I told you to separate all of those attributes per scene, per NPC, per location. You can warp check each attribute of each element, or you can just warp check the whole element. You can do that depending on the level of granularity and fine-grained details you want to change. If an NPC is not really important, you can just warp check it completely. If an NPC is of great importance in the adventure and you want to vary certain details but not the whole thing, you can warp check its attributes specific. And basically, those are the main mechanics of my rules. Now I've got two slight modifications of how Mythic works in order to incorporate a pre-written adventure. And the first one is when you roll a random event on your Mythic variations to fate check, not on the scene setting, and we'll see why later. So if you remember, there are situations in which a random event might come up, and the basic focus table has certain things like focus PC, focus NPC action, remote event, ambiguous event. I found that ambiguous event and remote event, I don't really like them too much. So what I do is I change remote event for gentle nudge towards the adventure, which means that when you get that random event, something related to an undiscovered element in your adventure script comes up. It can be either something related to an undiscovered one or a new clue about a known one. And I actually do that inspired by the Lone Crusader, because I think it's a good way of, reorienting your adventure towards the story you want to live. The other result is when you get an ambiguous event. In that case, what I do is I change that for a plot twist. The plot twist means that you take a story element that you already know, you take something you know for certain, and you change it. You'll see in the example that this random event can throw some very interesting curveballs in your story. The last part of my mechanics is a slight variation when setting the scenes. You know that in Mythic, when you set a scene, you decide what your hero is doing, and then you roll and compare the result against a chaos factor and alter or interrupt the scene if something happens. Well, the warp check covers that, so I just eliminate that. I don't check for the chaos factor. What I do is two things. First of all, I lay out the plot points for the scene according to the adventure. So for instance, if the party is entering the tavern in Bree and they first meet the patrons, then they talk to the tavern owner, and then they meet Aragorn, well, those are the 3 plot points. Then I take a page from the adventure crafter, and if there are less than 5 plot points, I roll a die, and with the probabilities that you want, basically, I haven't defined this too much. Let's see, we have 3 plot points. I roll a die to see if we have a new plot point inserted in any of these positions. So if I roll a fate check with 50-50, that tells me that, yeah, there is a new plot point, then I would roll a d4 to see if the new plot point is here, 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 or here. I do this a number of times equal to 5 minus the existing plot points. And then once I have my final list of plot points, I go over to the original ones and I warp check each of those to see if some plot point is changed. Of course, you can piggyback on everything that we know from Mythic, and if a plot point is changed, you can change it using another plot point from the Adventure Crafter, or if an NPC or creature is warped, you can change them using the Creature Crafter. So, to sum up, how do you play a pre-written module? Well, first, you compile your adventure script, writing down every element that you think is going to be important. If your adventure is too long or divided by areas or chapters, you can do just that section, which is going to be much more manageable. Once you have your adventure script, then you decide which warp threshold you're going to use, knowing that a high threshold is going to make your adventure change a lot compared to the base material. And a low threshold is going to introduce slight changes, but your adventure is going to be mostly the same as in the book. Then, and I didn't mention this, decide if you want to fix certain elements in the script. If, for instance, let's say that you're playing The Lord of the Rings and you want to fix that the ring has to be thrown to Mount Doom, then you would fix the where and the what. And if there are certain scenes that you really like, you would fix all those scenes. And if you don't want to change Rivendell because you like elves, you would fix Rivendell too. That means that when those elements come up in the adventure, they won't be warped. You won't check for them. Of course, you can do that a priori, or you can do that when you are playing. It's all right. I mean, no one's going to blame you if you do it later. Then you set the first scene of the adventure using the scene setting rules I outlined previously. And lastly, you just play the adventure, following the mechanics of Mythic and the ones that I've outlined. Of course, there are going to be situations in which Mythic will create completely new scenes additional to the adventure. I would say embrace those, because that means that Mythic is enriching your adventure, it's enriching the module. If at a certain moment you think or you feel that the adventure is getting too away from the material you want to play, well, either just trust that sometime you'll get a random event that will gently nudge you towards it, or you can decide to just introduce clues and leads that lead you back again to the material you want to play. I must re-emphasize that Mythic is like a wild stallion going wherever it wants to go. You must control it when you are playing with a pre-written adventure, because it can really go crazy. It's important that you do so. In a way, it's very similar to what a GM must do when running a railroady adventure. Of course, everything I've said relates to more linear adventures, which I think are the hardest ones to play solo. If your adventure is a sandbox like Tomb of Annihilation, well, then you've got it much easier. I mean, you can still use the warp check mechanics, but you won't have many problems just joining the story. But the warp check will still help you in transforming the story, so it's a surprise for you. And those are my mechanics. I guess that it's been like probably too much and I haven't explained it in too much detail. Again, you've got a link on the description to my full rules in written form and the play example. Don't fret too much over the example because I used 3 different versions of my mechanics as I was creating them. I will explain them in detail once I do the example video, but they are at least a good show of what you can do playing a pre-written module using Mythic. Nevertheless, I hope it's been understandable. As always, if you have any doubt, please hop by the Discord, Mythic GME. I'll be extremely happy to see how you've tested the rules. And there's a very interesting thing you can do. I've uploaded the adventure and the script. The adventure is free. So I would love for you to download the adventure and my script. And first of all, do the adventure script by yourself, then compare it with mine. And after that, play the adventure on your own. I'd love to see how the adventure changes when other people play it. It's actually one way of joining this solo RPG community in which we are extremely isolated because the activity we do is, well, isolating because it's solo RPG by definition. Having these common experiences is a way of sharing things like, oh, this NPC it turned out to be a traitor in my game. Anyway, my next video, as I've said, will be me going over Night of Blood, the adventure that I've played using my warp check mechanics. And that's all. If you're going to be at the UK Games Expo this weekend on the 1st of June, I'll be there. So please comment or just say hi if you see me. I'd be extremely happy to find someone that watches my videos. Anyway, this has been all. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. And I hope to see you again in the next video. Bye bye.